She begged for death, but death sent her something worse, someone who refused to let her die. The stones beneath Ilara's bare feet were sharp, deliberate. The villagers had chosen the oldest pathway to the forest, the one carved by centuries of sacrifices, each footfall a prayer to the darkness they feared and fed. She walked because refusal meant her sister would burn, because her mother had whispered goodbye in the pre-dawn darkness, hands trembling as she braided Ilara's hair one final time. 22 years of breathing, 22 years of grinding wheat, mending nets, bearing the weight of a village that had never wanted her. A woman born on the night the crops failed, marked as a harbinger even in her mother's arms. The ritual was ancient. Every 7 years, when the hunger called from the mountains, when livestock vanished and children's cries echoed unanswered through the valleys, the village gathered. They cast bones. They whispered names. And this time, the bones had spoken Ilara's name 3 times, which meant the gods themselves demanded it. She wore white, a mockery of purity. Her dress was linen, deliberately chosen to tear easily, to show flesh the beast could tear easier still. Around her wrist, they had tied a silver bell that chimed with each step, a dinner bell for the creature that dwelt in the castle ruins above the gorge. The forest swallowed sound. Trees towered like cathedral walls, their bark black and weeping sap that looked disturbingly like blood. The air tasted of copper and pine. Behind her, the village elder, Father Dimitri, with his crucifix and his coward smile, had recited prayers and stepped back toward the tree line. She could hear the others retreating, their footsteps hurried, almost gleeful. Ilara had stopped walking 10 minutes ago. She stood in a clearing where moonlight fell in geometric patterns through the canopy, illuminating moss-covered stones arranged in a circle, an altar, or perhaps a grave with no bottom. The bell at her wrist had stilled, and in that stillness she became aware of the watching. Not the beast, something else. Something that moved without sound, that breathed without drawing air, that existed in the spaces between her heartbeats. The figure emerged from shadow as though shadow itself had learned to wear a shape. Tall, impossibly elegant despite the tattered coat that might have been fashionable in centuries the village had forgotten. His face was angular, severe, a face carved from marble and lit from within by something that was not quite life and not quite death. His eyes held the color of old wine, and they looked at her with an intensity that made her skin feel translucent. "You came willingly," he said. His accent was foreign, weighted with languages that had turned to dust. "The bell around your wrist, the white dress, the acceptance in your eyes." He tilted his head, studying her like a scholar examining a text written in code. How rare, how perfectly, heartbreakingly rare. Ilara's throat had forgotten how to produce sound. She tried anyway. "Are you the beast?" A sound emerged from him, not quite a laugh. Something more wounded, more aware of tragedy. "The beast is what your priests call fear given form, but I am what your village fears knowing they created." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of him, old libraries, rain on stone, something floral and dying. "I am what happens when a king refuses to end, when power outlives conscience, when immortality becomes a punishment rather than a gift." He reached out one pale hand, and his fingers were impossibly long, marked with scars that looked centuries old. When he touched her cheek, she expected cold. Instead, she felt warmth, human warmth, and underneath it, a pulse that was too slow, too deliberate, as though his heart was a metronome keeping time with something she couldn't name. "Your village believes they feed the hungry," he said softly. "But they feed only themselves, their need to believe in gods, in purpose, in order." His fingers traced her jawline with unexpected gentleness. "Tell me your name, small offering. Tell me who you are before they made you into a prayer." "Ilara," she whispered. The name felt like rebellion, like reclaiming something that had never belonged to anyone but her. Ilara. He spoke it like an incantation, like a spell to undo time itself. Then hear me clearly. I will not consume you. I will not make you the ending your village designed. His eyes held hers, and in them she saw centuries of loneliness so profound it made her own suffering seem like a child's cry. But if you leave this forest alive, they will send another, and another, until the mountain swallows their prayers whole. Behind him, in the deeper darkness, something massive shifted. The actual beast, scaled, ancient, breathing fire like a funeral pyre, withdrew into the shadows as though called back by invisible chains. I can offer you a choice, he continued, his voice barely audible. Die here, as they intended, or live. Live as something other than their sacrifice. Live as something that might finally make them understand what they've done. Ilara looked at the clearing, at the stones arranged like a broken crown. She looked at the figure before her, neither savior nor monster, but something caught between, waiting in the dark for someone to finally see him as human. She did not step back. The castle had never known sunlight. Its walls were stone that predated empires, held together not by mortar, but by something older, perhaps intention, perhaps the weight of centuries that refused to crumble. Ilara climbed its spiral stairs with fingers trailing along walls that were cold, and then warm, and then cold again, as though the building itself breathed. Her rescuer, he had told her his name was Adrian, though she suspected it was one of many, led her through corridors lined with portraits. In each painting, the same face stared outward, younger in the earliest, increasingly burdened as the centuries progressed. The final portrait, hanging in what appeared to be a private chamber, showed him as he was now, beautiful and damned, with eyes that had seen too much to ever look away again. How long? She asked, standing before the portrait. 432 years, Adrian replied from behind her. His voice held no pride, only the weight of counting. I was a nobleman's son in what you would call the Renaissance. I believed I was chosen for immortality because I was worthy. He laughed quietly, bitterly. I was chosen because a witch I had spurned needed revenge, and my family had enough gold to purchase her curse from the priest who still served both God and darkness. Ilara turned to face him. In daylight, and there was no daylight here, only candles casting everything in amber and shadow, he appeared even more impossibly beautiful. His beauty was a weapon. She understood that. It was precisely why he kept the darkness close, why he wore it like armor. "The beast," she said. "Is it—" "My child," Adrian finished. "The first of 13 I created, before I understood the gravity of what I had done. I learned quickly that immortality without guidance becomes rage. Without purpose, it becomes hunger." He moved to a window, stained glass that filtered the moon into colors that had no names, and stared outward toward the village she had left behind. "I bound that first one with magic older than your god, kept it here, fed it with livestock, with the necessary cruelty that keeps it from descending on your people and ending them entirely." Ilara was beginning to understand. The sacrifices weren't feeding the beast. They were meant to feed Adrian. They were supposed to die in the clearing so that he would have reason to remain distant, occupied with the rituals of containment and mercy. "They think you're a monster," she said, "because it's easier than admitting the truth." Adrian's reflection in the glass appeared and disappeared as the candlelight wavered. "The truth is that your village is quite ordinary. They fear what they don't understand, and rather than face that fear, they feed it. They give it a name, a shape, a hunger. They make themselves feel righteous by offering the unwanted, the unusual, the daughters who don't fit into the narrow spaces they've carved for women." He turned to her then, and his eyes held a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. "Why didn't you run?" he asked. When I offered you a choice, you could have fled back to your village. They might not have killed you immediately. You might have had hours, days, to find another path. Alara thought of her mother's hands trembling as she braided her hair. She thought of the bell around her wrist, still there, though she had removed the clapper herself. She thought of the stones beneath her feet in that clearing, stones that had drunk the blood of girls like her for centuries. Because, she said quietly, I was already dying. I have been dying my entire life slowly in that village. They made sure of it the moment I was born. She looked at him directly. You are the first thing that has made me feel alive enough to want to live. Adrian's breath caught. For an immortal creature, a creature who had learned to exist in the spaces between heartbeats, this small reaction, a sound caught in his throat, a hand that trembled reaching for hers, meant everything. When he touched her again, it was different. Not testing, not cautious. His fingers intertwined with hers, and she felt the pulse beneath his skin. That slow, deliberate heartbeat that was more lament than life. If I keep you here, he said, I will change you. Not immediately, but eventually, time will demand it. You will grow old while I remain frozen, or I will have to choose. Let you die and shatter entirely, or make you what I am. Either way, I will destroy you. You already said I was already destroyed. Alara stepped closer. She could smell him now, that strange perfume of old stone and dying flowers and something underneath that was purely, achingly human. At least with you, the destruction might lead somewhere other than a grave. In the darkness of the castle, with only candles to mark time and the distant sound of the beast moving restlessly in its chains, Adrian lowered his head. His forehead touched hers, and she felt him trembling. Centuries of loneliness meeting someone who had chosen to see him not as a monster, but as a man. Then I will teach you, he whispered. I will teach you how to survive in the spaces between death and living. I will teach you the language of eternity. He paused, and she felt the weight of his next words like stones cast into deep water. And when the time comes, when you understand what I am, what I will make you become, if you still want to leave, I will let you go. Even though it will unmake me entirely. Behind them, a portrait watched with painted eyes, 432 years. And perhaps, finally, there might be something other than hunger waiting at the end of that infinite road. 3 months passed like pages turning in a book, written in a language Alara was only beginning to understand. The castle revealed itself in layers, not just rooms and corridors, but entire wings that appeared only during certain hours, libraries whose books were written in alphabets that predated language itself, gardens that bloomed in the perpetual twilight with flowers that smelled of memory and rain. Adrian became her teacher, not her lover. Not yet, though the tension between them had become a living thing, breathing in every corner of the castle. He showed her how to move through shadow, how to taste the difference between human blood and animal blood on the air without ever consuming either. He taught her that immortality was not strength but endurance, not power but witness. The curse, he explained one evening as they stood in the library, surrounded by centuries of accumulated knowledge, is not in what you become, it's in what you must remember. He pulled a journal from the shelf, one of hundreds, each labeled with a year. I have written down every person I've known, every name, every face, because if I let myself forget, then what's the point of lasting forever? I would simply be a ghost with a heartbeat. Alara read the names, lovers, children, friends. Each entry was a small death, a reminder that everyone she would ever know would turn to dust while she remained. How do you bear it? She asked. Poorly, Adrian answered. I have borne it poorly for 432 years. I have wept in libraries until the books swelled with my tears. I have starved myself for decades, hoping that perhaps this time the hunger would finally end me. He reached out and traced a line across her cheekbone, a gesture that had become familiar, almost tender. And then you walked into my forest, wearing a white dress and a bell, begging for death like it was a prayer. That night, they did not touch beyond that. But standing in the library, surrounded by the weight of centuries, something shifted between them. Ilara began to understand that love for an immortal was not romance. It was witness. It was choosing to stand in the same shadow for as long as shadows existed. The 4th month brought hunger. It arrived quietly, a whisper in her veins that grew into a roar. Ilara found herself drawn to the scent of Adrian's skin with an intensity that terrified her. She would catch the smell of his blood, copper and wine and something ancient, and her teeth would ache with a need she didn't understand. "It's beginning," Adrian said one night, finding her standing in the corridor at 3 a.m, trembling. "Your body is recognizing what it wants to become. You have perhaps another month before the choice becomes inevitable." "I didn't consent to this," Ilara said, though they both knew it was a lie. She had consented the moment she didn't run from the clearing. She had consented with every day she stayed, with every story he told about centuries and loss. "No," Adrian agreed, "but your body understands what your mind refuses to acknowledge. You want to stay. You want to stay forever. And the only way for that to happen is for me to complete what I began the moment I claimed you from that circle of stones." He offered her his wrist that night. Not as an invitation to feed, but as a question, as an offering. Ilara looked at the pale skin, at the dark veins just beneath the surface, at the slow pulse of immortal blood that had kept him alive for centuries. She thought of her mother. She thought of the bell around her wrist. She thought of the village, still making sacrifices, still believing in monsters and gods. She thought of Adrian, alone for 432 years, waiting for someone to see him. She brought his wrist to her mouth. The first drop of blood was copper and lightning. The second drop was fire that remade her from the inside out. By the third, she understood. This was not death. This was transformation. This was the moment she stopped being Ilara from the village and became something new, something that might finally belong. When Adrian pulled his wrist away, she was gasping, and her eyes had begun to change color, slowly, like sunset bleeding into night. 2 weeks, he whispered against her hair. In 2 weeks, you will hunger in a way that no human food can satisfy. And then, we will make the final choice together. Ilara looked at her hands. They were already changing, the skin taking on a luminescence it never had before, the nails darkening. The whole of her becoming something that existed between life and death, between the world of men and the realm of shadow. And she did not resist. And now, I invite you to leave a trace of your presence in the comments. Tell us where in the world you're watching from, and the exact hour you hear this story. We wish to know how far these immortal confessions travel, and at what moments of the night they find you. They came for her in the middle of autumn, when the leaves had turned the color of old blood, and the nights stretched long enough to swallow entire lives. 7 priests descended from the mountains with crosses and bells and prayers that tasted like fear. They had calculated the time. They understood the pattern of sacrifice. And when Ilara did not emerge from the forest alive, when weeks passed and no new plague descended on their livestock, no children fell ill, no crops withered, they knew something had changed. Father Dimitri led them, his face creased with righteous fury. He had brought the bishop's blessing and a vial of holy water, and he moved toward the castle's gates like a man walking toward Judgment Day itself. Adrian received them in the great hall, not alone, with Ilara standing beside him. She was barely recognizable. Her skin had taken on a luminescence that made candlelight seem dim. Her eyes were the color of dark wine, of blood left too long to oxidize. But it was her presence that changed everything, not the presence of a victim or an offering, but the presence of a choice made and owned. "She is corrupted," Father Dmitri declared, his voice cracking. "We have come to save her soul and destroy the corruption that holds her." Ilara stepped forward. Her movement was grace and predator elegance combined. When she spoke, her voice had taken on resonances that human vocal cords should not have been able to produce. "You came to save my soul?" She laughed, a sound like wind through ruins, like bells ringing backwards. "You threw my soul into this forest like you were disposing of garbage. You gave me to death so that you could sleep well in your beds." She moved toward the priests, and they retreated instinctively. "I was dying in your village. I was dying every moment of my life. Adrian did not corrupt me. He freed me." "You speak lies," another priest spat. "The demon has taken your tongue." Adrian stepped forward then, and the very air seemed to darken around him. He was not performing. This was simple truth spoken through the medium of his presence. "I am indeed what you call demon," he said quietly. "But not because I chose darkness. Because I was cursed centuries ago for the sin of refusing to marry a woman I did not love. My punishment was eternal life and the hunger that comes with it." He looked at the priests, and his gaze held the weight of 432 years. "But I have chosen something different than what your God prescribed. I have chosen to contain the hunger, to remain in this castle, to accept isolation as the price of not becoming a monster." He paused, "And then your village sent her, and I understood that perhaps there was another choice entirely." Father Dmitri raised his cross higher, as though it were a weapon. "You corrupt innocents! You damn souls to hell itself!" "No," Ilara said. She took Adrian's hand, and where their fingers intertwined, light seemed to gather in the spaces between their bones. "This is what corruption looks like, sending daughters to be devoured so that your conscience can rest. This is what damnation looks like. A life lived in service to a village that sees you as nothing but a problem to be disposed of." She looked at the priests directly. "I choose this. I choose Adrian. I choose eternity over the slow death you called living." The bishop's representative, an older man whose faith had weathered centuries of doubt, lowered his cross. He looked at Ilara and Adrian, at the way they stood together in the darkness of the hall, and he saw something he had spent his entire life pretending not to see. That love was not something dictated by priests or villages or the architecture of tradition. Love was a choice made in the dark by people who had nothing else to offer each other but presence. "If she goes willingly," the bishop's man said slowly, "then she is no longer our concern. She is beyond our reach and beyond our judgment." Father Dmitri sputtered, but the others were already turning away. The bishop's man lingered for a moment, and he spoke directly to Adrian. "The curse you carry, perhaps it is not a punishment. Perhaps it is a question, and she is your answer." They left as dawn began to break, retreating toward the village that had sent Ilara away as a sacrifice and received nothing but silence in return. The world would change because of this. Stories would shift. The next village to face hunger from the mountains would not have a sacrifice to offer, because word would spread. The beast had chosen mercy. The king had chosen love. In the castle, as sunlight turned to ash against the windows, Adrian held Ilara's hand. The transformation was nearly complete. In another week, she would need to feed. In another month, she would be fully what he was, eternal, unchanging, witness to centuries yet to come. "I could still send you away," Adrian said, "if you wish it." "No." Ilara turned to him, and her eyes now held the full color of his, that wine-dark gaze that had seen empires crumble. "I want to stay. I want to remember what we are. I want to write the names of everyone we love in journals just like yours. I want to know what it means to stand in the dark together and not be afraid." They descended into the tower that night, and there they found the beast, still bound in chains that were older than memory. Adrian broke those chains with a touch, not freeing it, but changing the nature of its imprisonment. The creature finally understood. It was not caged by magic, it was caged by choice. It could leave whenever it wished, but it remained because somewhere in its corrupted heart, it knew that Adrian was all the family it had ever had. In that moment, three beings, the immortal king, the human who chose his darkness, and the beast that was his first mistake, stood together in the depths of the castle. And for the first time in 432 years, Adrian wept, not from sorrow, but from the terrible, overwhelming relief of no longer being alone. The final transformation required ritual, not the hollow ceremonies of priests, but something older, something that predated language and prayer. Adrian led Elara to the deepest chamber of the castle, where the stones themselves seemed to bleed memory. The walls were covered in markings from centuries past, the names of every being Adrian had made, every soul he had drawn into eternity. Some of the names were faded, almost illegible, worn down by time like headstones in an abandoned cemetery. Others were recent, and among them, Adrian had carved a new one, Elara. Just her name, and beside it, a date. The date she had stood in the clearing wearing white, the date she had chosen not to run. "This is the weight," Adrian said, running his fingers over the names. "Every single one. I was supposed to forget them, you know. The curse included that mercy, a mind designed to fade, to slough off the weight of centuries like a snake sheds skin. But I refused to forget. I made myself remember because I believed that was the cost of immortality, bearing witness to everything you've lost." He led her to the chamber's center, where a basin of stone held water so clear it might have been made of light. The water was ancient. Adrian had carried it from a spring in the mountains of a country that no longer existed, water that had drunk the prayers of 1,000 years. "We wash in this," Adrian said, "not to cleanse, but to mark the transition, to move from one state of being to another." He began to remove his coat, ancient velvet, moth-eaten but still beautiful. "You are already becoming. I can see it in the way you move, in the color of your eyes, in the way your heartbeat has slowed to match mine. But the final step requires your blood and mine, mingled in this water, creating a seal that binds you to eternity." Elara undressed slowly. She was not embarrassed. Shame was something her village had tried to teach her, something she had finally shed like her mortality. Her skin had already begun to take on that luminescent quality, already begun to shift into something other than human. She could see it in her hands, in the way light seemed to gather at the edges of her bones. Adrian took a knife from the altar, silver, so ancient it predated the castle itself. Without ceremony, without preamble, he drew the blade across his own palm. His blood fell into the water like rubies, and the water itself seemed to sing. "Your turn," he said quietly. Elara took the knife. The metal was warm from Adrian's hand. She drew the blade across her own palm, her last human blood, the blood of a woman born in a village and destined to be devoured by darkness, and let it drip into the basin. Where her blood touched the water, the basin began to glow. Adrian took her unmarred hand and led her into the water. It was neither hot nor cold, but something else entirely, a temperature that existed outside the normal spectrum of sensation. As they stood together, the water rose, and Elara began to understand. This was not a ritual of transformation. It was a ritual of witness. She could see her entire life reflected in the surface of the water, her mother's trembling hands. The village gathered around the bones, the bell at her wrist. The moment she stood in the clearing and did not run, the moment Adrian emerged from shadow. She could also see his, centuries of isolation, lovers who had aged and died, children he had made, and then watched destroy themselves under the weight of immortality they had never wanted. libraries filled with journals, each one a small grave. And then, her, walking into his forest, making the choice that would finally break the cycle of loneliness and hunger and despair. "This is who you are," Adrian said, his voice echoing strangely in the water. "This is who we are together. Not monster and victim, not damned and redeemed, but two people who saw each other in the dark and chose not to look away." Elara felt something shift in her chest, not pain, but transformation so profound it approached pain. Her heart slowed further. Her lungs filled with water that did not drown her, but sustained her. Her eyes, fully now the color of Adrian's, looked out at a world that had suddenly become so much sharper, so much more real, so much more terrifying and beautiful than it had ever been before. When they emerged from the water, they were no longer human. But they were also no longer separate. They moved as a unit, their shadows fell in the same direction, their heartbeats synchronized to a rhythm that had nothing to do with the living world and everything to do with eternity. Adrian dressed her in robes he had kept for 432 years, waiting for the day he would finally need them. The fabric was silk the color of dark wine, and it fell across her skin like a prayer spoken in a language her body now understood. "What am I?" Elara asked, though she could already feel the answer in her veins. "What I am," Adrian replied. "Eternal, damned, chosen, dangerous." He paused, and his hand found hers in the darkness of the chamber. "But also loved. For the first time in centuries, I am loved by someone who sees me as I truly am and does not run." Together, they climbed the stairs from the chamber, leaving behind the basin of water and the names carved into stone. The weight of centuries carried forward into eternity. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the voices of those who chose eternity reach more hearts. 5 years passed. To the people in the village below, it felt like nothing. To Elara and Adrian, it felt like centuries compressed into moments, like watching the world turn slowly on an axis made of suffering and time. The village changed. New priests came. The sacrifices continued. But they were smaller now, less frequent. Fewer girls were offered. The power of the ritual seemed to diminish with each passing year, as though the gods themselves had grown weary of the bloodshed. Word spread, as it always did, through merchants and travelers and those who made it their business to know secrets. The beast was still in the mountains, the king was still in his castle, but something fundamental had shifted. The hunger had become something other than hunger, not satisfied, but transformed into something that could coexist with mercy. They received visitors sometimes, not priests, but philosophers, scholars, people who had heard the legend and wanted to understand what it meant that an immortal king had chosen to stop consuming, to stop creating new monsters in his image. Adrian received them with patience and dark humor. He showed them his library. He let them read his journals. He was not trying to convince them of anything, simply trying to bear witness to his own existence, to prove that he was not a character in a story designed to frighten children, but a person who had lived for an impossible amount of time and was still learning what it meant to be alive. Elara, meanwhile, discovered that eternity was not what she had expected. It was not an endless night of darkness and isolation. Instead, it was the discovery of textures and sensations that human perception had never been sophisticated enough to notice. She could hear music in the wind. She could taste color on her tongue. She could feel the slow, stately pulse of the earth itself, like the heartbeat of something vast and incomprehensibly ancient. But she could also feel the weight of time accumulating. 5 years, and already she could sense the decades stretching ahead, the centuries waiting like pages in a book she was only beginning to read. "Does it get easier?" she asked Adrian one night as they stood on the castle's highest tower, looking out at the world below. "No," he said honestly. "It gets different. You develop strategies for not going mad. You accept that everyone you love will eventually become names in a journal. You learn to find beauty in transience, knowing that you are the only permanent thing in a world designed to change without you. He paused, and his hand found hers with the ease of 5 years of constant proximity. But knowing that you chose this, knowing that you stood in a clearing wearing white and decided not to run, that makes it bearable. That makes eternity mean something other than punishment. A traveling scholar arrived that winter, a woman named Margot, who claimed to have once been an alchemist and was now something like a priestess of forgotten knowledge. She had traveled from the eastern reaches of Europe to see Adrian, and more importantly, to see Alara. "They speak of you in whispers," Margot told Alara as they sat in the library, surrounded by Adrian's centuries of accumulated knowledge. "The girl who was supposed to die and chose immortality instead. They say you are either a saint or a demon, depending on who you ask." "I am neither," Alara said. "I am simply someone who was disposable and found someone who refused to throw me away." Margot studied her with eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. "Do you regret it? Do you ever wish you had run, had found another path, had lived and died like humans are supposed to?" Alara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. She thought of her mother. She thought of the village that had cast her away. She thought of the life she would have lived, growing old while bearing children, working until her hands cracked and bled, dying without having ever truly been seen. "No," she said finally, "I do not regret it. This is harder than death would have been. But it is real. It is choice over and over again to stay. To love something that requires endurance, to witness and be witnessed." Margot nodded as though this confirmed something she had suspected. "Then you have understood something that most immortals never learn, that eternity is not about lasting forever. It is about choosing, in each moment, to remain, to love, to stay." She left the castle after a week, carrying with her a journal that Adrian had written specifically for her, pages about the nature of immortality, the cost of transformation, the terrible beauty of seeing the world change while you remain fixed. On her final night, she pulled Alara aside and pressed something into her hand. A small mirror, ancient and ornate, its surface tarnished by centuries. "This belonged to someone I loved," Margot said. "Someone who chose immortality and then regretted it so deeply that she walked into sunlight and let it burn her to nothing. She left me this mirror, and when I look into it, I still see her. Not her reflection, but her presence." She closed Alara's fingers around the mirror. "Keep it. When you grow weary of eternity, remember that some people choose to end it. But more importantly, remember that you have not chosen that. You have chosen to stay, and that choice matters." After Margot left, Alara held the mirror up to her face. She looked different than she had 5 years ago. Not older, but deeper somehow, as though the weight of those years had carved itself into her bones. But she also looked exactly as she had that night in the clearing, willing to meet darkness without flinching. 20 years into her immortality, Alara stood in the castle's tower and realized she had stopped counting days. Adrian was beside her, as he always was. The two of them had become so synchronized that sometimes she wasn't sure where she ended and he began. They moved together. They breathed together. They had learned to exist as a single entity stretched across the centuries. The village had changed. It had grown smaller. The sacrifice ritual had ceased entirely 3 years ago, when a new bishop had arrived and declared it a pagan abomination. The people had moved on, found new gods, new fears, new ways to cope with the darkness of the world. Sometimes, travelers still came to the castle with stories of the beast and the king and the girl who had chosen eternity. The stories had become legend. In some versions, she was a saint. In others, a demon. In a few, she was simply a symbol, The moment when an impossible creature chose love over isolation, chose transformation over destruction. Alara had stopped worrying about which version was true. She had learned that truth was something that changed depending on who was telling the story and from what distance they stood. "I was thinking," Adrian said one morning as dawn began to break, something that still happened even in the world of immortals, though it meant nothing in terms of time or weariness, about the names I carved into the chamber walls. "I have been thinking about whether they should be joined." Ilara understood what he was asking. "You want to carve our story into the stone?" "I want to mark this as different," Adrian said. "Not just another tragedy of immortality, but a place where someone chose to stay, where someone looked at forever and said yes." That night, they descended to the chamber together. Adrian took the silver knife, the one that had marked her transformation, and began to carve. But instead of writing just their names, he carved the entire story: the clearing in the forest, the white dress, the bell at her wrist. He carved the village and its desperate hunger. He carved the night she chose not to run. It took until dawn. When he finished, the chamber walls glowed with the weight of all the names, but Alara and Adrian's story took up an entire wall, carved in letters so large they could be seen from anywhere in the castle. "This is what I want people to know," Adrian said, surveying his work. "That immortality is not just suffering, it is also choice, over and over and over again." Alara pressed her hand against the stone, feeling the ancient pulse of the castle beneath her fingertips. "How long do you think we have?" she asked. "Truly, before time itself wears us down?" Adrian considered this. "I stopped counting centuries ago, but I think we have as long as we choose to stay. And I think, for the first time in 432 years, I want to stay." He turned to her, and in the candlelight of the chamber, he looked exactly as he had in every portrait on every wall, eternally beautiful, eternally damned, eternally loved. They ascended the tower one final time as the first rays of sunlight touched the mountains. The world below was still sleeping. The village was still held in shadow. But in the castle, for the first time in centuries, there was light, not the light of morning, but the light of two souls who had found each other in the dark and decided that darkness was bearable as long as they were not facing it alone. In the journals, the thick, leather-bound books that Adrian had filled with names for 432 years, a new entry was written. "Today, I am no longer afraid of eternity. Today, I realize that immortality is not a curse or a blessing, but a canvas. And she is the first color I have used in centuries to paint something other than sorrow. Subscribe if you believe mercy can resurrect even the damned."